Imagine waking up one day to find everything you love gone, your family, your health, your wealth, all of it swept away in the blink of an eye. How would you react? This is the story of Job, a man who faced unimaginable suffering despite his faith and righteousness. Job's story goes beyond just enduring loss. It reveals a deeper understanding of faith, resilience, and human perseverance. Stay with us, because in this video, we're about to uncover the profound meaning behind Job's suffering and how it can change the way we face life's hardships. Today, we take you to the ancient land of Uz, where a man named Job lived a life of incredible success and profound devotion to God. Job was wealthy beyond measure. He owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yokes of oxen, and 500 donkeys. His wealth wasn't only in his possessions, though. Job was also known for his integrity and unwavering faith. He was a man described as blameless and upright, someone who feared God and shunned evil. Every morning, Job would rise early and offer sacrifices for his children, thinking, "Perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." His concern for their spiritual well-being reflected the depth of his devotion. Job's 10 children, 7 sons, and 3 daughters would frequently gather to celebrate, hosting great feasts. These family celebrations were filled with joy, laughter, and unity. But what made Job truly remarkable was not just his wealth or his large family, but his devotion to God, which was evident in his daily actions. Despite his great fortune, Job always acknowledged that everything he had came from the hand of God. But Job was about to face a test that would challenge his faith in ways he never expected. His story, as we will see, is about more than personal suffering. It's about enduring faith and discovering profound truths about life's greatest trials. In the land of Uz, Job's prosperity was unrivaled. He was known far and wide not only for his wealth, but also for his righteousness. His estate was enormous, with thousands of sheep, camels, oxen, and donkeys grazing on his land. His household was large, with countless servants who worked his fields and cared for his livestock. But while Job's material wealth was great, it was his spiritual wealth that truly defined him. Job was a man who feared God and turned away from evil. Each morning, Job would rise before dawn to offer sacrifices on behalf of his children, ensuring that their hearts were pure before God. Job's devotion wasn't based on ritual alone. It was born out of genuine love and respect for God. His 10 children would often gather for feasts, and Job's love for them was evident in his constant prayers for their protection and spiritual well-being. His life seemed perfect, a balance of material success and deep faith. However, as we'll soon see, Job's faith was about to be tested in unimaginable ways. Everything he had worked for, everything he loved, was about to be taken from him. Job's story isn't just about the loss of wealth, it's about the endurance of faith in the face of suffering. What happens next will challenge everything Job believed about God, life, and justice. While Job lived his life of devotion on earth, a conversation took place in the heavenly realms that would forever change his world. God, surrounded by his angels, asked Satan if he had noticed Job's righteousness. "There is no one on earth like him," God said. "He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." But Satan, the great accuser, challenged Job's integrity. He argued that Job's faithfulness was tied to his wealth and comfort. "Does Job fear God for nothing?" Satan asked. According to Satan, Job's devotion was not genuine, it was simply a result of God's blessings. "But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face," Satan argued. Confident in Job's loyalty, God allowed Satan to test him, but with one condition. Satan could take away Job's possessions, but he could not harm Job physically. And so, Satan left God's presence, determined to prove that Job's faith was shallow, and that without his wealth and comfort, Job would abandon his devotion to God. Job, of course, was unaware of this heavenly conversation. He continued his life as usual, devoted to his family and his faith, completely unaware of the cosmic test that was about to unfold. What follows is a powerful exploration of the nature of faith and suffering, as Job's life is turned upside down. In one devastating day, Job's life was turned upside down by a series of unimaginable tragedies. The first messenger arrived with terrible news. The oxen were plowing, and the donkeys were grazing nearby when the Sabaeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who escaped to tell you. Before Job could process this, a second messenger arrived. The fire of God fell from the sky and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who escaped to tell you. As if these disasters weren't enough, a third messenger came. The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and made off with them. They killed the servants, and I am the only one who escaped to tell you. But the final and most heartbreaking news came when a fourth messenger arrived, his voice filled with sorrow. Your sons and daughters were feasting at the house of your oldest son, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are all dead. In a single day, Job lost everything: his wealth, his servants, and most devastatingly, his children. Overwhelmed by grief, Job tore his clothes and shaved his head in mourning. But instead of cursing God, Job fell to the ground in worship. He said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." Despite the overwhelming loss, Job did not sin by blaming God. His response to tragedy marked the beginning of a profound journey through grief, suffering, and ultimately, faith. What would you do if everything you loved was taken from you in an instant? Job's story is a testament to the strength of faith in the face of unimaginable loss. Job's trials did not end with the loss of his wealth and children. Seeing that Job had not cursed God, Satan sought permission from God to afflict Job physically. Skin for skin, Satan declared, "A man will give all he has for his own life. But stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face." Once again, God allowed Satan to test Job, but with one condition: he could not take Job's life. Job was soon afflicted with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Once a man of great dignity, Job now sat in the ashes, scraping his skin with a piece of broken pottery, trying to find relief from the constant pain. His physical suffering was immense, and it mirrored the emotional anguish of losing his children and possessions. Job, who had once been a respected figure in his community, was now unrecognizable, his body racked with pain and disfigurement. Seeing her husband's misery, Job's wife could no longer bear the sight of his suffering. In her despair, she turned to him and said, "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." Her words reflected her own broken spirit, unable to comprehend how a righteous man like Job could suffer so greatly. For her, it seemed that there was no reason to continue believing in a just God. But Job, even in his agony, responded with wisdom and faith. "Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" he asked. Job's response reflects his deep understanding that life's blessings and trials come from the same God, and that faith must endure through both. Despite his wife's despair and his own physical torment, Job did not waver in his faith. His suffering was not over, however. As Job continued to struggle with his pain, his friends arrived, bringing with them a series of judgments that would challenge Job's understanding of his suffering. When Job's 3 friends Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar heard of his suffering, they traveled to comfort him. However, upon seeing Job, they were so shocked by his appearance that they sat with him in silence for 7 days and nights. Their silence was a testament to the depth of Job's pain, as they realized that no words could adequately address his suffering. Their initial act of sitting quietly beside Job was an acknowledgement of the gravity of his grief. However, when they finally spoke, the comfort they intended to offer quickly turned into criticism. Eliphaz was the first to break the silence, and he gently reminded Job of how he had once consoled others in their time of need. But he also implied that Job's suffering might be the result of some hidden sin, urging Job to seek repentance. Bildad followed, insisting that God does not punish the innocent, suggesting that Job or even his children must have sinned. Zophar, the harshest of the three, accused Job of speaking arrogantly and declared that Job's suffering was deserved, implying that his punishment might even be less than he deserved. Job, devastated by their lack of understanding, defended his innocence. He lamented not only his physical suffering, but also the emotional torment of being accused by his closest friends. Job called them miserable comforters and insisted that he had done nothing to deserve such immense suffering. His friends' inability to see his pain beyond their rigid belief in divine retribution deepened Job's anguish, pushing him further into a state of despair. The failure of his friends to provide true comfort challenges us to consider how we approach others' pain. Are we offering judgment or true compassion? The conversation between Job and his friends turned into a heated debate about divine justice. Job's friends held firmly to the belief that God punishes the wicked and rewards the righteous. To them, Job's immense suffering could only mean that he had committed some grievous sin, and they urged him to repent. Job, however, knew he was blameless and could not accept the simplistic view that his suffering was merely punishment for sin. He questioned why the innocent sometimes suffer while the wicked prosper, challenging the traditional understanding of divine justice. Eliphaz, in particular, emphasized that no one can be completely righteous before God, implying that Job's suffering must be justified in some way. Bildad echoed these sentiments, arguing that God is always just and that Job must humble himself before him. Zophar was the most critical, going so far as to suggest that Job's punishment was less than what he deserved. Their rigid adherence to the idea of retributive justice left no room for the possibility that a righteous man could suffer without cause. Job, in his frustration, longed for a mediator who could stand between him and God, someone who could help him plead his case. He expressed a deep desire to understand why he was suffering and lamented the absence of any clear answers. The debate over justice in Job's story is profound. It asks the difficult question of why bad things happen to good people and whether suffering always has a clear reason. Job's challenge to the simplistic view of justice forces us to reflect on our own assumptions about the nature of suffering and divine will. After a long period of silence, when Job had expressed his frustrations and demanded answers, God finally responded, but not in the way Job expected. From a whirlwind, God spoke directly to Job, asking a series of rhetorical questions that highlighted Job's limited understanding of the universe. "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation?" God asked, reminding Job of his infinite power and wisdom in creating and governing the world. God's response was not a direct answer to Job's questions about justice or suffering. Instead, it was an invitation for Job to recognize the vastness and complexity of creation and how human understanding is limited. God spoke of the natural world, the animals, the constellations, and the forces of nature, asking Job if he could control any of these things. Through these questions, God revealed the gap between divine wisdom and human knowledge, subtly suggesting that not all suffering can be understood from a human perspective. Job, who had longed for an explanation of his suffering, was instead humbled by the realization of how small he was in comparison to the grandeur of the cosmos. He had questioned God's justice, but now he saw that his understanding of the divine plan was limited. In the end, Job responded with humility and repentance, saying, "I am unworthy. How can I reply to you?" God's response did not provide Job with the answers he sought, but it offered a perspective on the nature of divine wisdom and the human experience of suffering. Faced with the overwhelming reality of God's power and wisdom, Job realized the limits of his understanding. He had spent much of his time questioning why he, an innocent man, was suffering. But after God's powerful speech, Job no longer sought answers to his specific suffering. Instead, he recognized that there were mysteries in the universe beyond his comprehension. "I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know," Job confessed. Job's humility in the face of God's wisdom marked a turning point in his journey. He no longer demanded explanations for his suffering. Instead, he acknowledged that his knowledge was finite and that God's ways were beyond human understanding. Job had seen God not only as a distant, powerful deity, but as a personal and present force in his life. His famous words, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you," reflected a transformation in Job's relationship with God. He had moved from a place of knowing about God to truly experiencing Him. This moment of humility is a pivotal part of Job's story. It shows that the true answer to suffering is not always found in understanding why it happens, but in recognizing that human beings cannot always grasp the full scope of God's plan. Job's willingness to accept that there are things beyond his control and his trust in God's wisdom allowed him to find peace, even without the answers he initially sought. After Job's profound moment of humility before God, his story takes a turn towards restoration. God, who had allowed Satan to test Job's faith, now restored Job's fortunes, giving him twice as much as he had before. His livestock doubled, with 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yokes of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys. But the most significant part of Job's restoration came in the form of his family. God blessed him with 7 more sons and 3 daughters. His daughters, in particular, were renowned for their beauty, and in a departure from the norms of the time, Job granted them an inheritance along with their brothers. Job's restored fortunes were not merely a compensation for his suffering, but a symbol of God's grace and favor. He lived for 140 more years, seeing his children and grandchildren to the 4th generation. Job's life, which had been marked by unimaginable loss, ended in abundance and peace. However, the most important restoration Job experienced was not material but spiritual. His relationship with God had been transformed through his trials. Job no longer viewed his faith as a transactional relationship where righteousness automatically leads to blessings. Instead, he understood that faith means trusting in God's goodness, even when his ways are beyond our comprehension. Job's restoration shows that while suffering may come, it is not the end of the story. God's blessings can come in unexpected ways, and His grace often brings healing, renewal, and a deeper understanding of life's purpose. Job's final years were marked not just by material wealth, but by a profound peace and wisdom that could only come through his journey of faith. Job's story leaves a legacy that has resonated through the ages. His journey through intense suffering, followed by a profound encounter with God and ultimate restoration, provides lessons on faith, endurance, and the mystery of divine justice. Job's friends believed that suffering was always a direct consequence of sin, but Job's experience challenged this simplistic view. His story demonstrates that suffering can come to the righteous, and that faith is not about avoiding pain, but about trusting God in the midst of it. One of the most powerful aspects of Job's legacy is his transformation from a man who knew about God to a man who truly experienced God. His famous words, "I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you," reflect this deeper understanding. Job's faith was not destroyed by his suffering, it was refined and strengthened. He learned that faith is not about demanding answers or controlling outcomes, but about trusting in God's wisdom and grace. Job's legacy challenges us to think about how we respond to our own trials. When faced with pain and loss, do we turn away from God, or do we seek a deeper relationship with Him? Job's story shows us that while suffering is a part of life, it can lead to greater spiritual growth if we allow it. His final lesson is that while we may never fully understand the reasons behind our suffering, we can find peace in trusting the God who holds all things in His hands. Job's story is one of the most profound explorations of suffering and faith in human history. It teaches us that suffering is not always a punishment, and Job's story is one of the most profound explorations of suffering and faith in human history. It teaches us that suffering is not always a punishment, and that faith is not defined by a life free of pain, but by our ability to trust God even in the darkest times. Job's transformation from someone who simply knew about God to someone who truly experienced Him offers a powerful message about spiritual growth. Job's suffering allowed him to discover a deeper connection with God, one that transcended material blessings and went to the core of human existence. In your own life, how can you take Job's example and apply it to your trials? Let this story inspire you to deepen your faith, to trust in God's wisdom, and to embrace the journey of transformation that suffering can bring. Share this video with someone who needs encouragement today, and subscribe for more inspirational stories that will guide you on your path of faith and resilience. Together, we'll navigate life's challenges with hope and strength, trusting in the God who never leaves us, even in the storm.